Okay, welcome to TLGS 2024 conference. My name is Tina Bing, and I will be moderating today's presentation. I will also be collecting questions in the chat, so if you have any, please put it in there. And now I will hand it over to our presenters who will discuss, does anybody have any questions or anyone have any questions? Take it away, guys.
Either grammatical framing is totally fine with us. We can change the slide right now. Welcome all. Thank you for attending. It's so great to be with you all virtually. And I am going to talk today about, anyone have any questions?
Here
Encouraging
we go.
question asking behaviors in online and in-person graduate student and faculty workshops. I'm joined by two other presenters today, so I'll just give a little bit of my bio and talk through theirs, but then you'll see them as well along the way. So I, again, am Hannah Rempel. I am the Research and Learning Department Head at Oregon State University, and I've coordinated our graduate student workshop series for many years. And I also teach a couple workshops in that series, usually Zotero and the Literature Review Workshop. We have some logistical challenges today, but we will conquer them. One is that my colleague Clara is on sabbatical this year. So you and I both get the rare chance to see her today. She is on another continent, so very excited to have her across time zones joining us today. Clara is our data management specialist. She teaches usually workshops around research data management, MATLAB, Git. This year, she's not teaching any of those things, but we will look forward to having her back again. And then last, we have Adam Lindsley with us. And Adam's logistical challenge is that he decided to pick up the cold and flu that's been going around our town lately. So we will appreciate grace for him as he tries to explain things along the way. But if you do have any questions later, please feel free to send me or any of us a note afterwards. I've just put my email in the chat. So what we will be talking about today is a research study that we undertook. And you can probably guess from the title that it was around question asking. So we'll spend a little bit of time helping you to understand why we were interested in this topic of question asking. We'll explore what the literature said. We'll talk about what we did, share some of our results, what we learned, and then talk through some suggestions that we have for you. And these suggestions are particularly around pedagogical enhancements that you might consider. So lots, hopefully, for us to get through and think through together today. So as part of the introduction, just give a little context here, because when we're talking about pedagogy, context matters. So if our institution is wildly different from yours, it helps to know that from the beginning. So at Oregon State University, we have about 35,000 total students and 5,600-ish graduate students. So that's the overview of how many folks we serve. We are a land-grant university, and we tend to focus more in the STEM areas. So our College of Engineering is our largest college. And then we're also well represented across the departments, but particularly, again, in those STEM areas. So College of Agricultural Sciences, Oceanic and Atmospheric Sciences. And so this matters a bit in terms of what types of workshops we tend to offer. So I mentioned earlier that I've coordinated our graduate student and faculty workshop series for many years, many being, I think, 17 years at this point. And we offer a wide range of topics. So everything from citation managers to lit review to more data heavy kinds of tools. And that's evolved over time as we've learned what our students are interested in. And you can see that we've had some changes over time there in the graph on the left in terms of how many participants we see in our workshops. But you can see that we've had a climb up in recent years. There was, of course, a COVID dip year, but we've increased the number of participants we're seeing, and typically we're seeing 700-ish to 900-ish non-unique participants in a year. So as we have been teaching these workshops for many times and try and reflect on what we're doing, and we had that COVID interruption there, we had a change. So before COVID, we only offered our workshops in person. And I'll admit, I was some of the stubbornness behind that. I really like activities. I want high learner engagement, and I thought that happened best in an in-person context. And so was loath to put out recordings and have those sort of asynchronous experiences. But COVID happened, and like it or not, we all transitioned to teaching online. And since we've returned to our buildings, we at Oregon State University have continued to regularly offer both online and in-person versions of many of our workshops. But as people who are presenting and spending our time in these workshops, we've thought about the sustainability of teaching in both modalities, as well as how these two instructional options, online and in person, serve our graduate student learners. So if you're like me, you may have had the feeling that online participants maybe aren't as engaged with the material of the workshop generally. And if I was in person, I would be able to tell by your faces or, ask for a show of hands. And if you want to internally raise your hand, if you felt the same, you may have had that experience too. But we started to wonder if there was evidence to back up that feeling, or if it was just our perception, since we're pretty hardwired to look for those expressions on faces, to see those subtle vocal cues. And we don't get those in the online environment. So maybe that was just about us as instructors and not about the learner experience. So not to overly bury the lead, but we had this question about engagement in online versus on-site workshops and the perception that online wasn't engaging, was not as engaging. And so then we wanted to think through how we could assess engagement. And that led us to question asking. Before I get into more of the literature and what we did, though, I do want to pause for just a little bit and talk through how we intend to engage with you during this session. So first, we're going to be a little bit stinkery. We're going to say that we would appreciate your questions at any time throughout this session. So if you want to put questions in the chat or vocalize those, we are happy to engage with them at any point and not just wait until the end. So that's one thing to note. Second, we'll ask you to engage and reflect with us at a few points along the way as to what it feels like to be a learner in an online setting. And we'll also reflect some on what it's like to be an instructor in an online setting. We'll be suggesting some possible pedagogical adjustments, and we believe that reflection is key to making pedagogical change. So here comes the first prompt. Here's your warning. I gave you a little bit of build-up there for the warning part. Our first prompt for you as a learner, we're all learners here today, is to answer a question in writing. So I'm going to ask you either in a document of your choosing, you don't have to share it if you don't want to, or in the chat box, that's fine too. I'll ask you to answer a question that I'm going to pose to you. And again, in that learner mode, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask students often in literature review workshops. So if you could put yourself in that student mode, be ready to write. The question is, how do you start a research project? How do you start a research project? And I'll put that question in the chat box as well, but this could be a research project that you're creating a presentation about, a paper, or just something you're curious to learn more about. So go ahead and in written form, try and answer that question. All right. So what I did not tell you there in that prompt, you knew there was some trickery involved. I set a timer for myself. So that's why I was looking down and making adjustments on my phone. I set a 1 minute timer for you to answer that question in the chat. That's kind of a long time. I had to figure out what to do with my face and my hands as the instructor during that time. I chose to go and read all of your excellent responses there and kind of thumbs up them. So I had something to do. But some of you answered really quickly. And so I started to feel that guilt of like, oh, should I move on? Some of you are still coming yet and needed that extra time. So this is something Adam and I in particular played around with, how to give enough space for answering questions in chat. Just how long does it physically take to type a thing in, and then allow students to have that space and for us to learn to sit with the discomfort a little bit. So thank you again for engaging in that little exercise with us, and maybe think in future for yourself, how long does it take, and time yourself. And a minute is not a magic number. It's fine if you adjust otherwise, but that's where we've landed and what we're trying to use in our sessions. All right. So what does the literature say about engagement and question asking? So engaging learners is this core goal for instructors, but what does engagement actually mean in a learning context? So educational researchers have identified 3 types of student engagement that impact learning. And while much of this research has been conducted on undergrad students, I think that we can see many applications for graduate student engagement as well. I'll talk through these 3 types along with some current challenges related to these types of engagement. So the first type is emotional engagement, and sometimes you'll hear this referred to as affective engagement. And this gets at the feelings students bring to learning situations. So one current emotionally driven engagement challenge is that many students want to remain anonymous for fear of making a mistake in front of either their teachers or peers. Cognitive engagement is where you engage with the content and those kind of thinking aspects of the learning process. And an issue with cognitive engagement is how to appropriately challenge learners across many types of learning needs, many types of previous experiences. And what a large part of cognitive engagement deals with is motivation. And while it's easy to assume that graduate students might tend to be much more motivated to learn, they're people too, and their reasons for engaging in specific learning situations can also be widely varied. The last type of engagement that I'll talk about here is behavioral. So those are the actions students take to demonstrate that they're learning. And some of the challenges here come with just the wide array of different types of learning environments that are now available. So we have very large classes and large lecture halls, asynchronous online courses that allow for very different types of behavioral engagement. How do we get folks involved in all of those different behavioral situations? So I'll pause here to just see if there are any questions about these 3 types of learner engagement. And I'll say, for those who are worried, I won't wait a minute every time. So I know that your day is moving by. All right, feel free to put questions in the chat as you have them. So because of these widely different instructional settings now available, instructors have come up with creative pedagogical solutions for creating these engaging learner-centered environments. And some of the things that we see both in practice and in the literature are clickers, for example, which can be used in large classrooms to prompt cognitive and behavioral engagement. Polling tools are used in large classes as well as in online classes. Discussion prompts are a long-standing tool for cognitive engagement that have transitioned fairly well from in-person to online contexts. And problem-based activities and group collaboration are excellent ways to emotionally as well as cognitively engage students. Although, of course, as we all know, group collaboration can be challenging in both in-person and online contexts. So each of these pedagogical examples involves instructors asking students questions, posing that question via a clicker, giving students a discussion prompt or a question to consider. But we wondered what the literature said about how instructors can encourage students to ask questions. The act of question asking is such an important form of behavioral engagement. When learners ask questions, they're reframing knowledge within their own context. Researchers have found that generating questions improves learning and information retention. So asking questions can also increase student interest and engagement and demonstrates the level of the student's understanding of the content to the instructor. So super important. Of course, understandably, there are natural differences between humans, students, in their willingness to ask questions in classroom settings. Some students need more time to process information and get those questions out of their heads. Others are just more reticent, and some ask questions very quickly. So these differences should be acknowledged when considering student question asking behaviors. Instructors can play a really central role in stimulating student engagement in the form of asking questions. And one way researchers have found that instructors can encourage question asking behaviors is by mentoring students, by actively inviting them to participate in question asking activities, as well as by giving feedback on the questions they ask. Unfortunately, instructors can also have a negative impact on student question asking. If instructors do not effectively answer questions or ignore them, students will ask fewer questions. So I'll pause here to see if you have any questions about question asking behaviors. All right, so we next wondered about any differences that have been researched around question asking in this in-person versus online format. But before I report on the literature about online versus in-person question asking behaviors, I'd like you to take a literal minute to think about what your assumptions are about the difference in question asking between these two instructional settings. And again, feel free to just think, but also feel free to write in either your own document or paste your thoughts in the chat. All right, there went my timer, the literal 1 minute. Thank you all. So just looking through your responses, some actual variation there, but online does have some more options, especially as some observed for introverts. But picking up on some of those in-person things and carrying a conversation, we know how to do that when we're physically together in a different way and how to participate. So our feelings, as yours are a little mixed. So what have others found? So I'll say people have not done that much research on this yet. So there aren't that many studies to report out on yet. But the two that we did find, first, there were researchers who have looked at a large group preclinical medical student course, and they looked at the difference between both in-person and synchronous online courses. And in the online course, just a note that question asking was only enabled via chat, which made it really easy for them to count then afterwards. And the researchers found that students asked more questions in the online course than in that in-person course. And just a contextual note there, students knew each other from before because this happened during COVID, so they transitioned to the online. environment. So they had some connections to each other beforehand. The other study that we found is that researchers looked at a synchronous online course in Malaysia, and in that context, they learned that students preferred using the chat box rather than asking questions verbally, even though that mode was an option. And in follow-up interviews, the researchers learned that the preference for the chat box was due to shyness, discomfort with speaking English in class, and poor internet connectivity. So all things that I think we can resonate with. So question asking behaviors can be used as an indicator of student engagement, especially that behavioral engagement, but most of the literature on question asking behaviors describes term-long credit course instructional settings. And so alternative instruction settings like continuing ed classes or workshops, the kinds of instructional situations many of us who work in libraries and teach graduate students use, these provide some unique constraints, or may provide some unique constraints around question asking behaviors. And some of those constraints are that there are limited times to establish classroom norms, so less time for modeling those behaviors around question asking, limited time to build relationships, either between learners and instructors or between the learners themselves. Those things can all impact emotional engagement. Many workshops are voluntary. Ours all are. We don't charge. I know there's a few libraries who do, but voluntary is usually the way of it. And there usually aren't grades assigned. I know some folks give certificates at the end, but those sort of external motivators aren't the normal way that we worked. So all of those constraints made it kind of interesting for us to navigate this space. And that led us to our research question, which was, what differences are there in question asking behaviors between in-person versus online library workshops? So we developed a study to explore that, and Clara is going to describe that some more.
All right, so our methods. We have a question that Hannah has described, and to answer this question, what we did was to get 3 OSU librarians, Adam, Hannah, and me, and we each observed each other's workshops while we were teaching. These were all workshops that were offered online and in person. So the note taker tracked which questions were asked. They used a spreadsheet to record the questions. They also recorded behaviors around the question, like whether the question was able to be answered, or whether the question followed a prompt by the instructor, like, do you have any questions? And then there were questions. We also collected other information about the workshop, like, for example, the number of participants, the modality, online or in person, and the time of the day when it was offered. And finally, as a last step, we categorized these questions using 4 categories that I will describe in a minute. The data collection was conducted from January 2023 to June 2023 in both winter and spring terms. And these are the workshops that we looked at. These are workshops that are offered as part of our quarterly series of library workshops for grad students and faculty. OSU is on quarters, not semesters, and we offer the same workshops in each quarter. These workshops are free and are not required as part of any programmatic curriculum. Generally, participants participants come from a range of university departments, and all workshops are intended to appeal to a multidisciplinary audience. Some of the workshops in this study, as you can see, use a 2-part series approach. So, for example, an introductory session followed by an intermediate session, while others only have 1 session. When there are multiple sessions, the participants can decide whether they attend only the first session, the second session, or both parts. The length of the sessions ranges from 1 to 3 hours, depending on whether participants choose to stay for 1 part or both parts. It's an option. And each of the three instructors had previously taught the workshops observed in this study multiple times in both online and in-person formats. So it was never a first time workshop. So in particular, the three workshop topics that were observed were Zotero, which had two parts, Introduction and Intermediate, Git, which also had two parts, Introduction and Intermediate, and Introduction to QGIS. It's important to note that not all workshops require the same previous knowledge. The prerequisite knowledge required to understand the content presented in the Zotero workshop is lower than in the others. So the Zotero workshop requires fewer prerequisite skills with an expectation of a general knowledge of academic sources, citation styles, and the writing process. The Git workshop, which in this case is adapted from the software carpentry series, requires a few more prerequisite skills. People are more comfortable and follow the workshop better if they have an understanding on how to use the terminal interface, if they have some basic coding skills, if they are familiar with the concept of version control, and if they have ideas about projects that could be appropriate to use with Git. And the QGIS workshop is probably the one that requires more technical and domain-specific prerequisite skills and builds on participants' understanding of geospatial vocabulary, approaches used in geospatial analysis, as well as facility in using a highly detailed and technical software interface. So before I start giving you details about how we coded all the questions, I want to stop and make sure that everybody's following. Do you have any questions about what we did up to this point? And again, feel free to type it in the chat. I can see a comment. Despite some of the interaction drawbacks of online modalities, we should remember that it is often easier for many with disabilities to participate. Having the camera off or having more time to think and follow up can help some people concentrate. Definitely. All right. If you have any questions that you didn't have time to type, go ahead and type it. I'm gonna move on. So these are the four categories that we used to frame our coding, to code our answers. We used a question classification system that was described by Pedrosa de Jesus and their collaborators in 2003. This was a system that we liked because it acknowledges that all questions are valuable and that the quality of questions asked depends on the situation and the learner rather than the category of the question. Pedrosa de Jesus and co-authors describe the two question asking categories, confirmation and transformation, which are the ones you have on the left. But based on our experiences in workshop settings and the types of questions that we were seeing were asked, we added the two categories that you see on the right, the transitional category and the other. So let's take a look at in detail. Confirmation questions are questions that seek to clarify information. They want to clarify details. They attempt to differentiate between what is fact and what is speculation. They tackle issues of specific details or ask for examples or definitions. Confirmation questions are in general more mechanical in nature. So, for example, we got a lot of, could you repeat that? And we also got a lot of, I'm getting an error message. How do I resolve it? The transitional category is a category that is a little bit between confirmation and transformation, that are the ones that the original authors described. So we felt that we needed an intermediate category in there. The way we defined this is that the transitional category is intended to acknowledge that there are some types of questions that are beginning to express emerging ideas that aren't always tied to a realistic situation or a clear application. Sometimes they may be driven by pure curiosity and they help with the understanding. Transitional questions may also be starting to explore best practices, and they tend to be more conversational in nature. Some examples of these questions are, I'm curious about what happens if I use a different approach with this tool. Or what if instead of the approach you used, I tried doing the same thing a different way? So it's still focused on what the instructor is explaining, but it's trying to go a little bit ahead or to change things. The transformation category includes some restructuring or reorganization of the learner's current understanding. They tend to propose a hypothesis to see if the new concept will fit the proposed hypothesis, seek extension of knowledge, present an argument, identify missing information, examine ways of thinking, and challenge the accepted reasoning. Some examples of transformation questions are, I've used a similar but different tool or approach. How does it compare with what we're learning here? Or I think I can see how I might apply this in my own work. Does that application make sense? And finally, the fourth category is the other category. The other questions focus on logistics, on general information sharing, brief feedback signals, or are more like comments than questions. Examples of other questions include then, when will the next workshop in this series be held? Or I need to leave early, will you be sharing a recording? Well, questions in this other category weren't always strictly questions. We did feel that they were important and that it was important to capture as a sign of engagement, as one of the concerns instructors have is whether students are paying attention, both in online and in-person workshops, or in particular in online workshops, if the students are really present behind the blank Zoom screen. Any questions about each one of these categories? No? All right, if you have them, type them out in the chat. But now Adam will talk about results.
All right, friends, let's talk about the results from our study. I will do my best to mute myself when I inevitably start coughing. I apologize in advance, though, for that. So we gathered quite a lot of data for this study. We observed 20 workshops, of which 10 were online and 10 were in person. There were 127 attendees. We made 542 observations, and there were 316 questions. We recorded instructor prompts as well as student responses, that explains the difference between observations and questions. And in terms of statistics, these are all categorical data. So we used chi-squared and related tests, Fisher's exact tests to assess differences in modality, workshop content, and instructors. First, let's talk about workshop logistics. We'll look at differences by modality, so online or in person, question quantity, question type, time of day, and number of attendees. So looking at the modality, the online versus the in-person, against the number of questions asked. There really wasn't a significant difference by modality, at least with respect to number of questions yeah, that's that. However, considering modality versus question type, recall that's our confirmation, transformation, transitional, other sets of question types. As you can hopefully see by the giant red box, there are rather a lot more other questions in the online environment. What does that mean? And what happens if we remove the other questions from the dataset? Aha! Difference between online and in-person modalities was pretty much entirely down to the presence of those other questions. There is not a significant difference between question type versus modality in the absence of these other classified questions. So the questions are about the same, online or in person. Again, the other category, despite being a little bit of a catch-all, did pretty consistently show logistical questions. When will you post the recording of this session, or will it be recorded? When is the next session, if there is a next session? And statements of appreciation or general sort of gotta go type interactions. The majority of these other questions are largely unnecessary in the in-person environment. Attendees might give a hearty nod as thanks, or an appreciative grunt. There isn't an expectation that recording might have occurred in person, so they aren't asking about that. And conversely, in person, online, there is some social pressure to thank the presenter and indicate when you're leaving. And you have to put more effort into that than grunting generally.
So Adam, Rebecca has a question. They're very prescient. So I'll field that one to you.
The online sessions recorded. Indeed. I record all of mine, and I don't know if Clara records hers or not. Anna, not so much.
I do record mine when I'm asked to record them, which is not always.
Right. I always record mine and post them to a Canvas site, and we'll talk more about that later. There may be something to stating that you're going to record it that may influence things.
And then to Carmen's question, do people feel that need to post other questions to signal engagement? And so Adam.
Possibly, yeah. They may feel that need, or at the very least, to indicate that they didn't just show up to your workshop and then poof. It's, sort of common courtesy-ish to at least say bye. But in person, you might just nod or give a nice smile or something, and we wouldn't necessarily be recording that. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. All right. Thinking about the time of day, it didn't seem to make much of a difference for question quantity or type. As you can see on the left, we have the question quantity, and then on the right, we have the question type. The distributions are similar. We thought that perhaps folks would be more apt to ask questions in the morning, being all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and less likely to ask questions in the afternoon, post lunch. But nope, not really. We also wanted to know about the number of attendees with respect to the number of questions and type of questions. So, like, is there a critical mass for number of attendees to get a good question or dialogue going? But there really wasn't any clear difference in number of questions versus attendees. But what about the question type? So we've binned the workshops into 4 groups based on number of attendees. First bin is 1 to 3 attendees, second is 4 to 6, third is 7 to 9, and the fourth is 10 plus to allow for analysis. So there were differences between the quantity of question types versus the number of attendees. In our first bin, that was 1 to 3 attendees. The distribution of those questions was different than all of the rest. as was the second bid. So it seems like small groups have a different number of question types than larger groups. And I'm not entirely sure what that means. Maybe we can talk about it later. But in larger enrollment, there really wasn't any difference. So the story here is really that 1 and 2, 1 to 3, and 4 to 6 had distinct distributions of their confirmation, transformation, and transitional questions. Okay, let's consider how questions arose versus the modality. And by that I mean, did the instructor prompt for questions, i.e., are there any questions? And attendees then asked, versus questions arising from the attendees organically without a prompt. As you can see, there really wasn't a significant difference between online and in-person question prompting. It doesn't seem to matter. One more logistical consideration, which you may have been asking yourself by now, were there differences between individual sessions? In other words, if you considered the date of the workshop versus the question type, were those different? And indeed they were. But this is a little bit outside of the scope of our study and could be related to the makeup of attendees, faculty versus grad student attendance. We noticed a little bit that faculty tended to ask more transformational questions. It could also be down to the timing during the term. Are attendees excited to learn a new tool in week 2, or have they been ground down by their schooling by week 9 and they're just trying to get through? So some further studies needed there. Before we move on, do you have any questions about the logistics results? Feel free to put them in the chat as we go along. Okay, let's talk about workshop characteristics, or differences in workshop content with respect to question asking behavior. We'll look at prior knowledge, question type, and prompt. So this is the total questions versus the workshop content. So is there a difference between how many questions were asked versus what was being taught? And yes, there is. As you can see, QGIS on the far right there had rather a lot more questions than the other 2 workshop content types, or the other 4, excuse me. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, no, I didn't mute it. Okay, all right, sorry. I'm back. Whew. Yes, let's talk about the question type. So there's a significant difference in question type between workshops. QGIS and Git had more confirmation questions than the Zotero sessions, which again likely made sense based on the content. Git and QGIS have much higher technical knowledge requirements, and there are many more opportunities for attendees to get off track because we're following a tutorial set or something of that nature, which would result in more confirmation questions. Am I on track? What happened? I messed this up, et cetera, et cetera. All right, now question prompting. Are there differences in question prompting by workshop content? Yes, indeed. This is likely related to the question type that we saw in the previous slide, and also differences in instructor question prompting style, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. There are many more prompted questions in the Zotero sessions than there are in Git or QGIS, despite our, well, at least for me, very frequently asking for questions. Doesn't mean that they answer them. All right. Questions about workshop characteristics? No. All right, let's go. So now we're looking at instructor practices. These are differences between Hannah, Clara, and myself. So following up on workshop content versus prompting, here we have instructor versus prompting. And Hannah is quite a bit different than Clara and I. Thinking about how we actually teach these materials, Hannah tends to give very specific prompts for students, whereas Clara and I are more likely to just ask for questions in general. Do you have any questions? That sort of a thing. So that might be driving engagement. Let's keep going. And finally, we have the question type versus the instructor. And we see that there is a significant difference between all three of us. And there seems to be perhaps an inverse relationship between the number of confirmation questions and the number of transitional questions. And what that means exactly, I have no idea. I would love to hear it if you have thoughts about it. Let's keep going. Questions on instructor practices? Absolutely not. Let's keep going. So, discussion and recommendations. So our initial assumptions here, we thought that online teaching feels different, that there would probably be differences in question type or question quantity with respect to in-person teaching, and also that attendance drives question asking activity, especially online. But neither of those things seem to be borne out in our data. Keeping in mind these are 3 technical workshops or sets of workshops that, also, the data does not capture differences in learner level. And also, my son is trying to get in here. Camera or mic on, off for Zoom. So, does that drive being required to be present in the online environment? Does that drive question asking? Maybe. We didn't require that. Also, I alluded to earlier that recording the session might kind of spike engagement drop off. If at the beginning I say I'm going to record this, then perhaps you, attendee, don't have to actually pay attention. And maybe you don't, because you can just look at it later. Are you going to look at it later? Probably not. And there are likely other engagement drop-off triggers, which perhaps we can think about as we move forward here. But that is all I have to say about that.
All right, so I want to pause here. So we were kind of experimenting on you, full disclosure. We prompted you for questions, and we were looking at that sort of organic versus prompted thing. So the total number of questions that you've asked to this point, Clara, what was our count? I think maybe I saw 2 in the chat.
Yeah, there were 2 questions asked in the chat, but I also counted the answers to your prompts, Hannah, and there were 28 answers to your prompts, plus many, many emojis.
So we give super high marks to you for engagement. So well done all, and thank you for allowing us to guinea pig with you a little bit. So I'm going to close us out by giving some recommendations. So our overarching recommendation is to offer workshops in multiple modalities. I think you all have said in the chat better than I could for sure why this is important, especially having that online option, recognizing the just super rich options that gives to people that we did not afford before. Both of these options can engage grad student learners, and this population, beyond what you said, has so many good reasons for wanting choice in how they take part in our professional development offerings. This could be geographic region, folks could be doing field work, some people could be in a lab on campus, but they need to monitor and experiment in the background. So having that option of online, super important. Also still important to have those in-person opportunities. Some people need that physical push to get out of their space and come learn a thing somewhere else, and to engage with others in person and have that other kind of peer and instructor interaction. Sometimes too, we have software on our computers in the library that they might not have access to. So offer choice. Even if we as instructors might be more comfortable in one modality or another, we should respect that they need different opportunities to learn. So in addition to this overarching recommendation, we'll offer some additional pedagogical recommendations for encouraging question asking based on the literature as well as our own research findings. And these are each rooted in those 3 types of engagement. So the first set of recommendations is around those emotional supports. So the recommendations here, first and foremost, begin with creating a supportive instructional environment by being welcoming and clear about the structure of your workshop and acknowledging that there'll be time for questions. For many graduate student workshop situations, you'll have a limited amount of time to demonstrate a supportive environment. And while there's no one way to do this, there's some examples out there. So some of us like to have music playing as participants join either our physical or our virtual spaces. Others of us greet students as they enter the room, again, either physical or virtual. Depending on the number of attendees, some of us ask for introductions. If in person, some people like to ask for name tents. This is one of those big jumps forward in Zoom. We've already got a built-in name tent, so it's already there. Make sure at the workshop itself to, again, be clear about logistics and give that contact info for that follow-up. Right, some of these are just, general best practices, but arrive early enough. Make sure the tech works so that's not where you're distracted and putting your energy. So all of these strategies will help students feel more comfortable to ask students. I just saw that psychological safety aspect. Yep, for sure. In addition, provide multiple routes for asking questions. So online, I'd say consider accepting both chat and voice, along with those clear routes for sending messages afterwards. In person, in addition to vocalized questions, consider having a whiteboard somewhere in the room available for questions that arise that folks can stand up and go write their questions on. Or maybe, again, for that anonymity part, collect written questions either at a particular point or at several points throughout the workshop. So value that anonymity and don't kind of, force folks to say something out loud that they might not be okay with sharing. Build in multiple opportunities for students to ask questions. Even if they don't ask questions the first or the second or the third time, they'll start to see that pattern that you're establishing of being open to questions. And also be sure to ask for questions while they're practicing or engaging in some problem-solving activities, not just after you've presented lecture content. Finally, be mindful of how you respond to questions. Ideally, invite a peer reviewer to come and observe how you respond to questions. This was a super helpful side benefit of this project for us, is that we had somebody give feedback on our question asking, and so then acknowledge your own reactions to those behaviors. So are you somebody who's very excited? Are you dismissive? Are you fearful? Are you confusing? If you're like me, is your problem that it takes you 5 minutes to respond to every question because you're so excited? Maybe a little less. So observe and make changes accordingly. In terms of recommendations around cognitive supports, previous researchers have found that many questions asked in a tutoring session context were what they called common ground questions. So these included, establishing a shared vocabulary, building an understanding of the purpose of the content. So to do that, to establish a shared common ground in a workshop type setting, consider sending the prerequisites, if you have any, for a workshop. Send some background reading, links to documentation. For example, Clara has extensive documentation on GitHub. I have a lengthy Zotero LibGuide. Adam's created a Canvas space for his QGIS documentation. So you could send all of that ahead of time. And you could consider sending some question prompts to participants to think through. Though we totally acknowledge that in this non-required context, that pre-engagement can be highly variable. I'd also say give enough background information for students to understand the context of the topic, but don't fill in all the gaps for them or over provide information. Some educational researchers suggest that providing somewhat less information resulted in more questions. So giving students space to ask those questions will help them gain those core skills needed to engage in problem solving. And then make adaptations over time based on what you learn about the prerequisite knowledge that your students bring about the types of questions they asked, and adapt, make changes. That's what we're all about as we learn how to be better instructors. So finally, behavioral supports. So similar to the emotional engagement recommendations for building in repeated, predictable opportunities for asking questions, budget enough time for having those questions, especially for topics with a higher learning curve for your learner audience. And while we found that explicit prompts asking if students had questions does not actually result in having students ask questions at that point in time, just like you, as much as you can build in some doing and some free form time for questions, that's where they really arise. So where there's troubleshooting opportunities, let folks build in all the time they need for asking questions, as well as follow-up opportunities. As Adam hinted at before, one of my practices is to ask specific, less vague questions. So instead of, does anyone have any questions, ask targeted questions. For example, in Zotero, I'll ask, did you notice anything about the metadata collected in the info tab? So think of specific situations that you can prompt them. And as best you can, model question asking behaviors. When students ask questions or engage in those transitional, more conversational questions, follow up with more long answer or higher order questions and demonstrate that you're listening and that this question asking process is all part of this shared learning experience. So with that, here's some references because librarians, we love them. Does anyone have any final questions for us?
I think that's it. I think we're ready for the next one. You guys did a great job.